morning. It's good to be with you this morning. I hate to give you the bad news, but I'm going to give you the bad news today. So my name is Brooke Hempell. I work for a company called Barna Group, and we have been tracking faith trends in our country and to some degree around the world for over 30 years. So we've been kind of watching what's happening with the spiritual nature of our country, of the church, and how culture is intersecting with faith. And so what I'm going to do is lay out this context of cultural Christianity today. And I will just give you the warning that this is going to be a little rough, but there's good news at the end. So bear with me, take a deep breath. Our first slide, these are empty pews because it's true. There are so many churches at this moment that are closing. In fact, one just down the street from me the other day voted to close its doors. It's a wonderful historic community that is no longer relevant. And so it's really about this trend line. There's been a lot in the news, even the last couple of weeks, about this. What is a Christian, right? So if you think of naming yourself a Christian, would you say you're a Christian? People used to say yes all the time. Obviously, they had different interpretations of what that meant, and they didn't always live it out. But there's a rapid decline because you can see this self-identification with Christian, the blue line at the top, 81%, has quickly dropped to 74% because it's not important to say that I'm a Christian anymore. Our culture says that's not something that we really value. And so people who maybe followed along with this for a long time because their family was Christian, or maybe their grandparents practiced, they kind of said, oh yeah, I'm a Christian, but it really wasn't changing their heart. Well, now they're free to let go of that. So what you see in the red line at the bottom, the counter trend to Christians saying, or people saying I'm a Christian, is I'm none. I'm nothing. This is not relevant to me. And this is the total U.S. population. So if 21% of U.S. adults, it's a little higher than that actually in 2019 and 2020, would say that they are nothing, atheist, agnostic, or more commonly just none, it's actually way higher when we start to look at younger generations, which we'll see in just a minute. But I study statistics, I study demographics. One thing we know about averages is they change really slowly over time. That doesn't look like a really steep decline, but it's huge. We never see that kind of change so quickly. So what's happened is our country has hit a tipping point where it's totally fine to say, like, religion is not a thing. I just live in the here and now. I'm just concerned about my world right now. And our country has really adopted that, and we see that in the way people are living out their lives day to day. So looking at the next slide, what does that mean for followers of Jesus? Well, we interestingly, going back to 2003, had a not terribly dissimilar number of people saying they claimed a faith in Jesus, about 2/3 of the U.S. population. It kind of rose for a while, right? Because they got pulled in by some really great messages that were speaking to their hearts. But then they sat in the pews and they just took it all in, they just consumed it, and they didn't do anything with it. And it didn't change their hearts. So many have walked away, and you see those numbers dropping really precipitously over the last decade of people who would say that they have a faith in Jesus. Again, those are huge numbers. When you're tracking just averages, statistical averages, you don't usually see that kind of decline. So basically, King Jesus is not king in so many Christian lives. Right? That's what we're kind of seeing in our data, and it continues to change. Let's look at the next slide, which shows us by generation what's going on. Because really, when you look at the next generation, that's where you see where we're going, right? So you see baby boomers here. You've got 80% of them claiming to be Christian, and you follow the trends down by generation, and then Gen Z, who are kind of early 20-somethings and below, our teens, only 59% say that they're Christian. And the huge rise in that red number, 34%. Say they're atheist, agnostic, or none. And interestingly, when we did this study about 2 years ago, we saw this big jump in the number of them who are willing to actually say that they're atheist. Because for a long time, it was around 6-7%, and all of a sudden, boom, like, I don't have a problem saying there is no God. Because I live in a world where that's not valued. And I live in a world where I don't see lives transformed. So I don't know if I believe this. Right? So let's double click on Gen Z for a second and look at a few trends that we noticed when we did this deep dive of teens at the time about 2 years ago. So this is Gen Z. They were born 1999 or After that, so they are our current day, like early 20s and teens. Let's look at this next slide, because this is one of the things that really defines what is shaping their beliefs: science. So it used to be, if you look at that bottom line, that people would say, I can believe in the Bible and all that it tells me, and I can believe in science and what I learn from science, and I see them as complementary. Like, I understand how God's scripture reveals something, and then we see it in the natural world, and that's something that kind of fits alongside itself to me, right? But increasingly over time, science has become faith for the younger generation. So millennials and Gen Z increasingly say, not only do I see conflict between science and the Bible, I'm going to go with science. So the next slide will show you what we heard directly from the mouths of some of our Gen Zs. We did some focus groups with teens, and this was in a Christian teen focus group. Most of these students went to Christian schools, and this was one who didn't. He went to a public school. And he said, the stuff we learn in school today, like evolution, how the world came to be, it makes you question, because they're scientists. They study this every day, i.e., they're like God. They know stuff, right? He says, I've learned all these things about God, but I can't ignore that this thing is in my head. And because culture around me is telling me that science is actually where truth is, not that God is where truth is, right? So this is kind of infiltrating the next, actually, to be fair, my generation, Gen X, this is what I learned growing up in school, and I came to Christ much older in life, and similarly had no idea that science was not God. But this is just more prevalent in our youngest generation. So increasingly we're seeing this. Science is a real big stumbling block, and it causes them to question the reality of God, to question if this is even relevant in their lives. Let's look at morality. They're also struggling to see that there is some broader sense of what is morally good in the world. These are people that strongly agree with these statements. There's also people who just say, I agree, so you don't have to strongly agree. What's morally right and wrong changes over time based on society or depends on what an individual believes. In other words, there is no absolute truth. There's only relative truth. And you see that growing. You see this line changing by generation, and we've been tracking it over time. It's growing. What you believe is what you believe. What I believe is what I believe. You do you. You just do you, right? So you become the arbiter of truth. Next slide. Also in the area of gender. What is gender? 33% of young people, 20 and younger at this time, said gender is actually how you feel. It's not the sex you were born with. That is a huge, huge stumbling block for this generation. They cannot make sense of what Scripture tells us and what the world tells them. They really need to understand. They need to wrestle with the world and wrestle with how God defines the world, right? They need help kind of guiding through that culture. Last quote from someone in Gen Z. So this is not a Christian. This is a non-Christian focus group participant. Said, hey, there's no such thing as truth. There are facts. Facts are things I can know are true. But truth, it can always change, right? So you see, if you're evaluating Christianity, if you're evaluating Scripture through that lens, it's just a book that some people wrote, and it's really not relevant to me today. Because what's really relevant to me today, next slide, is happiness. Half of young people say, my main goal, all of my goal in life is just to be happy. It's all about me. And that, again, has been growing over the years we've tracked this. We've seen this desire for happiness as the ultimate in people's lives. But happiness is different than joy. And there is a huge, huge felt need here, this is where I see the hope, which is there's a lack of joy and there's a lack of hope in this generation because there's nothing to pin it to. If I'm the ultimate goal of my life, then there's nothing bigger and better than my experience. So if I don't have a king who's greater than me, how am I going to find hope in life, right? So this is where the hope comes in for us, for the next generation. One more slide on this. We actually asked youth pastors what they would assess separately before we did the study with teens as the biggest issues facing this next generation. They basically nailed all those things. They said technology and social media have shaped the way that they think about things. They've shaped the way they interact with others. They don't have good, deep relationships that can transform them. They have this sense of spiritual moral relativism. They have questions about gender and sexuality, and they have this consumerist mindset. I'm just going to get what I need and then I'm done, right? And it's not leading to disciples that are resilient. So a couple more things I want to show you from a generation a little older. So that was Gen Z. Now we're looking at millennials, basically. 18 to 35 is this particular study. This is a study we did around the world, but it pretty much is the same in the US as it is around the world, which is interesting because it tells us there's a global culture here at play. This is a really connected generation. So how are they connected? Next slide. They're connected to events around the world. 77% say that. Or they feel connected to people around the world. More than half say that. But then they don't have real relationships. So a third say, I feel deeply cared for by people around me, or I have someone who believes in me. So next slide. This generation, this 18 to 35, and it's even more so as you go into teens, feels so connected to the world and disconnected from people around them. And that is where we're missing the boat on discipleship, because that's where it comes in. You can't change this generation by just speaking loudly and having it reverberate across culture. It's one by one. You've got to change these hearts one by one. Last slide. We've dubbed this digital Babylon, right? This is a time of exiles. There are some faithful few, and they're resilient. That is the good news. There's a small percentage of U.S. Christian teens who are very resilient, and young adults who are very resilient. But they live in a really accelerated, complex culture, and it's hard. So they need help becoming disciples and being disciple makers so that that light can spread, because that light shines brightest in the darkness.